Hello, and welcome to First Christian Church's Adult Fellowship Bible Study. We continue in Revelations. Today's topic is a study of the first 8 verses of chapter 6. These verses involve the opening of the first 4 seals of the scroll that was mentioned last week. And this section is probably much better known under the title The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. When the Lamb opened the sealed scroll, catastrophic violence is unleashed on the earth's population in the form of war, famine, plagues, and death. Those who interpret Revelations as predictive prophecy for the long term attempt to identify all this with specific historical events that are either happening in their lifetime or that have happened in history, and tend to use it as some sort of a timeline where things are based in either current history or past history. Specifically certain wars, earthquakes, certain plagues, certain economic collapses, says Dr. Eugene Boring at Texas Christian University. He and Dr. Fred Craddock, in their New Testament commentary, say modern scholars interpret this differently, however. They see John here envisioning near-term troubling events in his world that he and his people are experiencing, and that John believes these signal Christ's return is to be very soon. Scholars suggest John is trying to put the persecution already being experienced by Christians and the church in his day into a meaningful context, yet he stays within the framework of God's plan for history as he understands it, coming as a Christian, coming from a very strong Jewish background. Many scholars point out that ignorance of Old Testament is a major hindrance to understanding the book of Revelation. The late Dr. Bruce Metzner at Princeton Theological, in his book that's entitled Breaking the Code, a commentary on Revelation, taught that opening the seals is the main action of Revelation. It brings to focus the persecution of Christians from outside as well as the struggle that's going on within the religion. It is presented as a judgment of God upon the enemies of true Christians. Literary scholars argue it is important for us to realize the seal openings are written as a series of dramatic episodes. Note that the first 4 seals are opened all in one act, or in one vision or episode, you might say. They are all announced with trumpet, which had very significant meaning in its day and time. It meant, this is God's message. Stop what you are doing now. Listen fully. Discern carefully. And obey. In this case, obey what is the will of God rather than the will of Caesar. They add, it is important that we understand this is not written for the modern Western mindset. Several scholars point this out. Instead, this was written for a Semitic mindset of the late 1st century AD and relates well with other apocalyptic literature of the time. We moderns like each scene to be standalone stories and not to divulge the main message until the end. Instead, their approach was to run through a whole story in each dramatic scene so that the core message was repeated over and over multiple times. Thus the seven seals are telling a common story, with some variation repeated 7 times. Only to, for example, these 7 seals then will be followed by 7 trumpets scenes, then 7 bowls, which repeat the same pattern over and over. All are building to a final lasting judgment scene that we will find at the end of the book. Dr. Brian Blount of Union Theological Seminary in Richmond, Virginia, writes that the message is simple. God will execute a cosmic verdict that judges those who have set themselves up as lords and gods, that's little l and little g, in violation of the one true God's, capital G's, will. Those who truly follow Christ as their Lord and submit to God's will achieve salvation, but not before many of them suffer a martyr's death for not cursing their true Lord and Christ and swearing allegiance to the Roman emperor. 4 horsemen of the apocalypse is the image that unites the verses 1 through 8. This imagery is borrowed from Zechariah chapter 6. However, here a single horse with rider is used rather than 4 horses all hitched or harnessed together to a war chariot. But it involves the same color pattern with certain slight variations. In Revelation, the attention is on the rider, who never speaks, nor is direction of travel indicated. It is not clear whether this rider is of earth or heaven, but most scholars suggest an earthly rider is implied. Dr. Metzner taught that Revelations clearly is a reflection of how our power enters into the divine plan. So he says you have to follow the power. Appreciate where the power is located, which is not the case in most New Testament writings. Thus, scholars argue over who is this rider with power. Some suggest a false Christ. Others say no, this rider is working for God, from whom all power is derived. But most scholars would go along this line, suggesting these are more likely human figures, as humans have free will to mess up the power that's granted to them. Thus, under the current situation, the apocalyptic mindset is that God cannot intervene to stop them at this point, as the earth is ruled by Satan and his influence. We have to appreciate that that's part of the apocalyptic mindset. Scholars say don't lose that idea. It's not necessarily consistent with a lot of Christian thinking. The first seal reveals a white horse that depicts warfare. Scholars argue this is likely implying the principal enemy of Rome, which at the time would have been the Parthians on the eastern border. White was their sacred color. Their warriors carried a bow, as does the rider in this case, and Rome never mastered the use of the bow, but the Parthians did, and it was their primary weapon, both for their mounted and their foot. This army had defeated Rome in several battles at border areas, 3 times from the time Rome began to conquer there between 53 BC and 62 AD. The idea then seemed to be this enemy will not just defeat you on your border the next time, but will run over you and destroy you. And such war leads to the other suffering, which is the following 3 horses. The second seal leads to a red horse then, in which the rider carries a sword, and it's a big sword. Such a warrior's job in battle at the time was to destroy and violently slaughter everything around, any form of life, not limited just to the soldier, but all. Such were used in all armies of the day, and they inflicted heavy casualties upon the citizenry that they were trying to overrun, to help destroy the home base support for any army that was attacking. A major source of any military's sustained power and strength comes from its home base. And that is what many people, this is the follow-up after the Bowman breakthrough. The third seal reveals a black horse. Its rider is holding scales. A nearby voice is announcing a quart of wheat for 4 days' wages, and 3 quarts barley for a day's wages. I'm sorry, it was for a day's wages instead of 4 days' wages. And do not damage the oil and the wine. Scholars interpret this as economic collapse, which often occurs during war, in this case due to economic inflation. Famine and disease will follow. We need to realize in interpreting this something about the monetary value mentioned here. The denarius was a day's wage at the time. Normally that day's wage, using the scale used, would have bought 10 to 15 quarts of wheat. Now it's only buying 1 quart of wheat. It took 4 quarts roughly to make that Roman standard loaf of bread, which then was divided into 8 portions. And one of those portions made up 70% of the caloric content for the average Roman male at the day and time. So this is unbelievable inflation. Thus the staple food is being destroyed. Also, what is this warning not to damage the olive and the vine, or the wine rather? Realize at the time all the land was owned by wealthy class. Landowners were taking wheatland out of production and out of grain production, and planting olive trees and vineyards, as it yielded much more profit in the long term. This had actually resulted in a major famine in Asia in 92 AD, this very province where this is happening, because they did not have sufficient land production in wheat to take care of them if they had a drought or other short failures. So there was a major loss of wheat supply. Yet wine and olive oil was plentiful. Emperor Domitian of the time ordered a 50% reduction in orchard and vineyards to ensure adequate wheat potential. Thus, this command here, or this situation, do not damage olive trees and vineyards, is going to help keep the supply of grain limited and the price high, to ensure more suffering. Opening seal 4 reveals a pale green horse, which brings the worst suffering yet, with a fourth of the population dead. This rider is named Death. Pale green is the color of sickness and death. As a boy growing up in eastern Kentucky, I heard it used several times. For example, she's dying. Why, she's pale greenish. She ain't here for long. I can remember that instant in my life. Hades here is the Greek word or the translation of the Greek word for dead, or it is actually somewhat, or Sheol in Hebrew. Several scholars argue this God is not approving these events, but just allowing them to happen as they are following the rules of human activity and not God's activity. This is what happens when humans have their way and rely on their wants and their systems, and not on God's will and God's systems. Several say this is a drama about humans' will, about human will, or humans having free will, and should be understood in such a venue. It's also about economic and military systems in play, run by humans, that are in violation of God's rules and God's will. I hope that gives you some idea of what the scholars are providing us here to help us interpret the four horsemen of the apocalypse. And I hope you have a good week, and we'll see you again next week, hopefully.